Obviously, tinfoils are tinfoil. Are you going to use that as tag now? Brilliant.
Hello and welcome to the PriceWriters podcast with Jeremy Keating and me, Catrin Townsend. Join us as we explore and discuss the world of insurance-related books, offering our insights, recommendations, and crucially, how to apply it to insurance pricing roles. Today, we'll be talking about the Pathfinders by Will Iredale, which tells the story of an elite Royal Air Force unit in World War II. While we're going to focus on what this can teach pricing teams about organisational structure, specialisation, and innovation, in this episode, we will be referencing war, air raids, and casualties in the historical context of the Second World War. There's a lot going on in the world currently that touches these themes, so if this episode feels a little too close to home for you, please know that we hold you in our thoughts, stay safe, and we love you. Let's be honest, Jeremy, this isn't the usual kind of book that we talk about on this podcast. This book tells the tale of the Pathfinders, a special elite unit that was set up in World War II by Don Bennett to solve the problem of inaccurate bombing across Europe. So tell us why it might resonate with pricing professionals.
This is a great book, actually. I really enjoyed it. So it tells the story of an elite RAF group that would go ahead of the main bombing runs to pinpoint accurately where they needed to target. And it's just such a rich and interesting story. The book is very good at giving us the high level, the strategic decisions that were made, and also the individual tales of people that actually went ahead and did this work and what their lives were like whilst they did it. And also filling in the detail in between of the people that worked in and around this elite unit as well. It does not shy away from ethical dilemmas. And it's quite interesting in my mind how there's so much discussion behind the scenes on whether the targets they're choosing or the tactics they're using for bombing are ethical and acceptable. And so often they end up with this kind of mishmash of different people's opinions to sort of come to an average of stuff that everyone could kind of agree was acceptable and probably wasn't the optimal in any particular dimension. But I found Adele, the way he presents these issues with empathy and balance and really gives us testimonials from both sides of the conflict is very powerful.
The Pathfinders had a really clear goal. Do you think that most pricing teams feel that their goal is clear?
I think the Pathfinders did have a really clear goal, and it's quite interesting. I had no idea just how much they collected statistics on their bombing runs to analyze it and discuss what worked and what didn't. I do think pricing teams generally do have a clear goal. So it's hitting the financial targets that are set by the organization is usually quite clear to us. So we know that we need a particular loss ratio or a particular amount of volume or GWP. So in that way, I do think goals are quite clear. And I do think it's quite similar for the Pathfinders, actually. It was pretty clear that they needed to hit those targets. Those, like, they were physical targets, ours are financial targets. A lot of what goes into that, though, similar to a pricing team, is not very well defined, actually, and not necessarily all that clear. I don't think, as I mentioned, there were lots of people involved behind the scenes in deciding what the strategy and the tactics were. And often it was kind of a mishmash of stuff. I would think it very hard for any one person to tell you succinctly what the strategy was of the RAF or what the strategy is of the pricing team.
The Pathfinder unit was set up to improve the accuracy of the RAF. And what's really interesting about how they achieved that higher accuracy is that they didn't try and improve the accuracy of every aircraft team. Don Bennett recognized that a level of specialization and leadership would be more effective, which is why he set up the Pathfinder units. Those planes would fly ahead of the main squadron and they would drop colored flares close to, so I think it was like 3 miles out and then 1 mile out and then on the target itself. And then those flares would light the way for the subsequent aircraft. To what extent do you think that specialization and leadership carries across to improving pricing goals?
I think the leadership point particularly is an interesting one. So when you come down to it, pricing team in a modern insurance company is responsible for the revenue and margin of the organization. They are the team most at the forefront of actually delivering on those plans. I know that obviously other people are involved. You need your sales team to actually get the product sold. And I'm not underestimating how important that is. You need claims to keep hold of costs and so on. But actually, we're very much at the vanguard as a pricing team. If we don't deliver, a lot of the rest of it doesn't matter. So, and it was like that for the Pathfinders, really. They had to be accurate. They had to be on point to actually do this. If they made a mistake, then things would go wrong. And in fact, there is a particular story in there where they dropped the flares in the wrong place. And then subsequently, all the bombs were dropped in the wrong place. So I do think that carries across quite well, is to say that you actually really need your pricing team, your leaders to be really, really good in order for people to follow and also do a good job. And then on the specialization, I think it's an interesting point. So, from my point of view, I think it is important that people have multiple skills. So, I think it's good for people to move around the pricing team, even if they end up specializing in a particular area that they are best at or feel most comfortable in. I think, like with so many things, it's important to actually move around the team and find out what it's like. I don't think it works very well if someone's role is just really very, very specific, such as every year they remake the household peril cost models or something like that because they don't learn about the whole process. And in fact, I think one of the biggest things people in pricing can learn about that's important is actually learning about claims, because we are effectively constantly modeling claims. That's where the cost actually comes from. So having more knowledge of these things is just so important.
The thing that struck me when reading the book was how some of the innovations were super low tech. So, of course, there were the high tech improvements too, and the new aircraft mosquito. But one example is how they discovered that if you drop strips of tinfoil over Berlin, it would refract the Germans' radar, and it made it appear that a huge, 1,000 squadron air force was flying over Berlin, when in fact it was less than 20 planes. Of course, that trick didn't work forever, but it did work the first couple of times, enough to allow the rest of the Air Force to get their hits in elsewhere. What are the low tech improvements that you think pricing teams are missing? What's our tinfoil?
I think a big thing that people are missing actually is organization and just being really, really good at actually organizing things and timing them properly. I've seen this done really well, but particularly communicating a lot with teams outside of pricing all of the time, particularly if you're thinking about making a change. If you're going to bring in GBMs, don't build a GBM and then tell people that you built a GBM and expect them to sign it off and deploy it. Okay. Talk to them from the start, talk to them about what you're doing, make it clear, have a roadmap and a plan so people know the times that things are going to happen. They know when they'll need to sign things off and they know what they're doing. So I think really getting that, which is just a low tech thing, but actually just working well with other teams is important. So you got organizational tools. We've talked about Git before. I think Kanban's quite good for like low tech organization. I think Kanban works quite well in a pricing team where you've got pieces that you need to move forward through a process and talk to people regularly about. And it's important that people know where they are and you can be nice and flexible and move things about.
For me, it's not reviewing your estimates.
Okay.
At the end of every sortie, the RAF would send a plane with a camera across the site to assess the accuracy and then compare that to their goals. There was this continual review and improve. I just don't see that being done often in the pricing space. I think of estimation processes like setting inflation numbers. Teams might do that quarterly, say, but we set the numbers but never review them. We never look back and say, well, our 2022 number, obviously we're not going to keep predicting that, but how close was our prediction to the actual, even its initial phases? And by looking back at that, we can actually spot trends in our own estimation, like, oh, we tend to overestimate inflation initially. That would be really valuable feedback for a team to know. It's so simple though, and it really would help future prediction. I wonder whether it's seen as being too low tech, almost too simple, or is it a fear of failure? Like they don't want to.
I I think there's a general malaise in pricing about actually the level of uncertainty in what we do. I think there's a tendency to come up with the expected values and just hope that that's okay. And then we don't go back and revisit them. And we ought to, because we ought to understand the difference between our predictions and our actuals, because that would help us understand future volatility. And like you say, is there's systematic issues that we make as well. So I think it's something that we generally avoid too much in pricing, actually admitting that what we're doing is effectively random variables. There's distributions around these things. We're not just going to hit the expected value all the time. What really struck me is the extreme pace of technological change during the Second World War. So it came up in this book, and I've read about it elsewhere. So very often, like with the Pathfinders, the Allies were actually not the most advanced at the start of the war. The Axis had already found ways of using radar beams across the UK to guide their own bombers to locations. They're relatively primitive, but it's forms of triangulation to actually mean that bombers arrive at least over the right cities. So we were behind. We were using septons to navigate by the stars to actually arrive at the right locations at the start of the war, which is jaw dropping for people. I was really shocked by that. But actually, in those 5, 6 years of the war, we went from celestial navigation to incredibly accurate radar technology. And and there were lots of changes. So even the flares, literally teams of people were working on making the flares better, more powerful, stronger, brighter, different colors to indicate different things. The actual dissemination through the squadrons of information, which is something a lot of people find hard, a lot of organizations find hard, was really well done. So people knew what coloured flares they were looking out for on which sorties and so on. So things were not lost. People knew what they were doing. So I think innovation often comes from necessity. And this scenario where you really did see innovation happening and it was necessary, they really needed to innovate, they really needed to improve. The sheer scale of the logistics is incredible. So they had to perfectly time planes taking off from multiple sites across the UK, line them up to travel over to Europe together. They might have had escorts, they might have escorts a certain amount of the way. They have to get certain planes in front for the pathfinding to actually work. They had to time these. There are documented times where they arrived within moments of specific times that they had to be over a city in Germany after like a 5 hour flight, like, and arriving specifically at the right time and place. That was hard. And that was things that they achieved from really being behind at the start to actually be well out in front by the end of the war. It really is quite incredible. But yeah, I'm blown away by the logistics and the complicated nature of these things and how many people had to organize these things to make sure they worked perfectly. And this was serious things. You know, if they got them wrong, there were serious consequences.
Yeah, it's absolutely staggering. They tell you in a lot of detail about the meetings they had before they went on these sorties. Everyone involved would need to be at the meeting listening intently for their exact role, their exact destination, their exact timing, like you say. And I wonder whether one of the reasons that there was such accuracy in hitting the goals and getting to the destinations exactly at the right time was that there was such a high level of personal responsibility and
Mm,
within the plane.
yeah.
So within the plane, a team maybe of 4 to 5 people. So pilot, navigator, rear gunner, bomber, and maybe some others in some of the larger planes. But those 4 or 5 people, they were responsible for each other in that situation. And if anything went wrong, it would have been their lives. There was such a sense of accountability instead of feeling able to pass the buck upwards or across or to anything else really was just very acute for them. And the risks of being early or late were incredibly high for these young
Mm,
men. I think it said that the average number of sorties in the Pathfinders was less than 5. It was incredibly low, wasn't it? So,
mm,
huge
mm,
amount of danger. But the one thing that I thought was really fascinating despite that, actually, was that, yes, they didn't have long expected lifespans, but there was still so much emphasis on developing the people. And
mm,
one of the
mm.
things that Don Bennett in particular encouraged was for the pilots in particular to improve their aerial acrobatic, loops and loops, tight corkscrew spins, flying upside down or between buildings. And you think in a lot of ways that seems very frivolous, but
Mm,
this book really details some instances where those acrobatics actually got people out of tight scrapes. And I
yeah.
think pricing teams can probably learn something from this because, yes, we have very high churn, particularly if your team is based in London. And sometimes I think that's used as a reason not to develop people. Think, well, I don't want to put a lot of effort in because they might leave soon. But developing your people and improving personal accountability or even team accountability actually gets results. I really feel like the Pathfinders proved that. Very, very small team. There was, I, I can't remember how many squadrons, but they were very small in comparison to the rest of the RAF. And yet they had such an outsized impact.
Yeah, I do agree. Think about the role of the navigator. The navigator would be in the center of the plane. It would be freezing cold. And it was like being spun around constantly with someone banging pans in your ears whilst you try and do calculus.
Right.
Right? And it was crucial to get these numbers right as
Mhm.
well. And some of us complain that it's Monday morning. So it is a very different world, and they did work extremely, extremely hard to actually achieve these things.
So, Jeremy, do you recommend this book, A, to pricing professionals and B, for general consumption?
I definitely recommend it for general consumption. I think anyone that's interested in military history, the Second World War, technology, there's just such a big list of reasons why someone would find this book interesting. So, yes, I do. Pricing professionals, I'm not as sure really. I think I took a lot away from it, but I don't necessarily think every pricing professional would. I think you already have to be quite interested in military history and technology to really benefit from it. What do you think, Catrin?
Well, I recommend this book for general consumption because I did literally recommend this book to you, Jeremy. It was one of my 5-star reads last year. Such a good book. I think I agree with you. Pricing professionals are very busy and the read across is interesting, but if you don't read that many books, you don't have that much time to commit to reading. I probably would pick something a little bit more relevant, but I do love this book. The other book I'd recommend on a similar theme is Mosquito by Roland White. And it's more focused on the aircraft, obviously not so much on the Pathfinders or that side of it. But if you want a book that's all about technological improvement and balancing research and development with other goals, I think the Mosquito book is really interesting. There's loads of great things in this book. Like one of the other things was that they introduced badges of appreciation for those who had done 10 sorties. And that's not a particularly big number, but it's enough that people wanted to do it.
Yeah.
They also did another one, I think it's called the Golden Eagle at 25. And
Just
it
being a
obviously,
Pathfinder, there was a special badge for as well, and it was super coveted. Yeah.
yeah, like, I know that badges, stickers, whatever, that this kind of token gesture can feel a bit empty, sometimes can feel a bit patronizing. But I do think that if it's something that you as an organization say, no, actually, this is something we really value. So we are going to, you
Mhm.
know, do a special reward for it, whether that's a certificate, whether that's a call out in a team meeting or something like that. But making sure that you acknowledge whatever you say is valuable. We've talked about appreciation on the podcast before, but I do think that appreciation is something that all teams can do better, particularly pricing teams, just because we're under a lot of pressure a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And so I love this example. Obviously, this Pathfinder team was under so much pressure, and yet the Golden Eagle and the badges that they got was still something that just introduced a bit of levity and appreciation.
I think that's really true. I think actually on the development point, it's interesting how many of them went to go on to be quite accomplished in their lives after being Pathfinders. So there's people who were involved in government policy afterwards, there's an MP, there are people that led airlines, and there are the smaller stories of people that were pilots and so on, that people went on to quite accomplished careers after being Pathfinders. And I think that does show in the level of training and development that they had.
People who can work well under pressure are probably going to do well whatever they do.
Mm-hmm.
I think training your people to stay calm under pressure and to still achieve under pressure, to not forget everything they know, and also to lead others under pressure. I think that is an incredibly rare talent.
Mm.
And I think that Don Bennett managed to bottle this effectively. And yeah, it really, really turned the course of the war, to be honest. So a really good book. I really enjoyed this book. Do you know
Mm.
what I loved about this book? It was brilliantly readable. It flew by. That's such a bad pun. But it genuinely in the time, yeah, you know what I mean? It was it read really easily. It didn't feel like a slog. I I really enjoyed this book. I wanted to listen to it constantly. I actually think this is probably one of the most readable books I've read about military improvement in Second World War.
I think it is super readable. I think it's got a really good balance between how much of it is first-hand accounts actually, and about the people that I would say on the ground. But again, that's totally the wrong thing to say. At the forefront, the actual people that were doing the flying or doing the navigating, it's got really good information about them. But I thought also going all the way up to Churchill ultimately made the decision to set up the Pathfinders, and it was actually against resistance from supposed expert bombers and so on. He felt it wasn't the right course to be taking. And in fact, actually, it's quite interesting how the whole reason it's set up is from statistics. Initially, they were thought that they were doing okay at bombing. I mean, it wasn't until people collected the statistics and were like, it was really awful, wasn't
Like
it?
a third.
Was it a third actually made it to the right location, but even they didn't necessarily hit the target?
Yeah, it's like it was about a third within 3 miles initially.
Yeah, that was it. A
Really
third
good.
actually managed to make it within 3 miles, and by the end of the war, they were pretty much hitting specific
It was
buildings. It's
over
stunning.
90%. Yeah.
Yeah, it was absolutely stunning how much more accurate they became over that short period. Yeah, I think that's something that really strikes me is the organisation of the RAF and the Pathfinders were just incredibly well done. So they did develop people, they did have good structures in place, they did make sure people knew what their job was. People didn't go off being like not understanding what their role was. So obviously there were still mistakes because mistakes occur, but it was a rarer thing.
The book does talk a lot about the organization of the unit, but like I say,
Mm,
it balances with these personal testimonies. Your organization is ultimately built of individuals. And I think this book really, it makes the individual shine. And I think this book actually makes a wonderful case that with the right people and the development that you give them,
mm.
then they just need the right structures and they're going to achieve it for you. I think this book is all about development and the right structures that combined just magic.
That's all right. All right. Next time, we'll be discussing Winning Conditions by Christine Hofbeck, who is absolutely fantastic. So, she was a Survivor contestant, she's a fellow actress, and excellent to follow on LinkedIn as well. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. PriceWriters transforms pricing professionals into the most respected leaders in insurance. So, find out more about our PriceWriter Pro platform by visiting pricewriters.com.